The right that we were fighting for was the right to decide if you want to be treated or not, basically. And I think, yes, she did have lots of options. And in the final analysis, it was her choice.
Hello and welcome to DNet, the Disability Network. I'm Joe Coughlin.
And I'm Susan Pettit. Today we'll take a look back at the case of Nancy B. Paralyzed from the neck down by Guillain-Barré syndrome and dependent on a respirator to breathe, she appealed to the courts to have it disconnected. Her request raised many issues of concern to people with disabilities: euthanasia, quality of life, control, and informed choice. The story first hit the headlines last November when the Quebec Superior Court heard her petition to be taken off life support. Karen Gross had this report.
Hotel Dieu Hospital has been home to Nancy for the past 2.5 years. She's 24 and she suffers from Guillain-Barré syndrome, a degenerative disease that has paralyzed her from her shoulders to her feet. She's only alive because a mechanical respirator breathes for her. Last spring, Nancy decided she didn't want to go on like this. She asked her doctor to disconnect her respirator, but fearing legal action, the doctor and the hospital refused. So Nancy tried starving herself, but went back to eating after 2 weeks because of intolerable stomach pains. Now she's asked the court to issue an injunction authorizing the hospital to remove the respirator.
Her life is hard, it's humiliating. She feels she loses dignity, and she doesn't have any hope anymore. And she just doesn't want to go on like this.
The case is the first of its kind in Canada. Doctors do disconnect the life support of people who are comatose or brain dead, but Nancy is fully conscious, incurable, but technically not terminally ill. The hospital is worried about provisions in the criminal code that outlaw euthanasia or assisting suicide. Specifically this one. It says, no person is entitled to consent to have death inflicted on him, and such consent does not affect the criminal responsibility of any person by whom death may be inflicted on the person by whom consent is given. But Anne Lapointe says Nancy's isn't a case of euthanasia.
To my position, it's a case of putting an end to an unwanted treatment.
And she argues that's legal according to the Quebec Civil Code. It says, no person may be made to undergo care of any nature, whether for examination, specimen taking, removal of tissue, or any other act, except with his consent. That article, say many experts in medical ethics, is key to Nancy's case.
So we're not talking about stopping her breathing. What we're talking about is whether she's got the right to refuse an artificial treatment that sustains her breathing. And the answer is yes, she does have the right to refuse that.
Most people who suffer from Guillain-Barré syndrome do recover after a few months. But specialists who've examined Nancy say she won't. Her nerves are damaged beyond repair. If her respirator is removed, they say she'll die within 3 minutes. Karen Gross, CBC News, Quebec City.
Justice Jacques Dufour heard the legal arguments and visited Nancy B. in hospital to hear her testimony. He decided to wait till after the holiday season to announce his decision. When we come back, we'll take a look at reaction to that decision.
Nancy B.'s request to be disconnected from her respirator stirred up a lot of emotion in her lawyer, her family, and the judge who reviewed the case, Justice Jacques Dufour. He announced his decision on January the 6th. Tom Kennedy had this report from Quebec.
Nancy B.'s lawyer and family took her case to court in November. Her private tragedy became a moving debate over an individual's right to die, a young woman paralyzed with no hope of recovery. From her hospital bed, Nancy argued she has the right to refuse medical treatment, even if it means she will die. And today, her lawyer told her the judge agrees.
I got there today and I said, listen, we have a judgment, we have a decision today. The first reaction was a smile, then there were tears, there were mixed emotions.
Since the beginning of this case, Nancy's doctors have left no doubt if the respirator is shut off, there can be only one result.
She will die in the next minutes.
And how would it be painful for her?
It could be painful, yes, like somebody who was drowning. But we'll try to help her not panicking in those moments.
But a psychiatrist told the court Nancy is able to take decisions and understand their consequences. Nancy's mother testified she supports whatever her daughter decides. And when the judge visited the hospital, Nancy herself told him, in what he described later as moving testimony, "I am fed up with living on a respirator. It's no longer a life." In his decision today, the judge wrote that according to Quebec's civil code, no treatment, whatever its nature, may be given without a patient's consent. But he acknowledged a legal dilemma does exist, particularly for the person who actually pulls the plug. The criminal code states that anyone who causes death to another person is guilty of an indictable offense and is liable to imprisonment for life. But he ruled that turning off the respirator is not killing Nancy, it is simply allowing nature to take its course. The person will in no way be committing a crime. The judge never made any secret of the fact that he found the case a difficult one, that he hoped Nancy would change her mind. But Nancy's lawyer said today that's unlikely.
She seemed determined today. I do not think she will change her mind. The judgment gives her the opportunity to do so if she wants to.
The head of the Canadian Medical Association's Ethics Committee, Dr. Noel Doy, said the decision is in total accord with the ethics of the medical profession. The patient has the right to refuse treatment. But many people with disabilities had mixed reactions to the announcement. Ian Hannamansing looked at what it meant to disabled people.
At Ward 7 of the Pearson Rehab Hospital, the case of Nancy B. has received a lot of attention. The patients here need respirators to live. Most say Nancy should have a right to make her own decision, but all say they are troubled by the decision she has made.
People talk about rights to die, and that sort of frightens me in a way, because I don't want them to go the other way. Life means too much to me that I don't want to die.
Jeanette Anderson has been here since she contracted polio 36 years ago. She says she has a great deal of sympathy for Nancy B. and some unsolicited advice.
I would say hang on for a while before you make that final decision. You know, because I've been there, and the first few years, if I had the choice, I probably would have gone the route she seems to be wanting to take, but not now, no.
In Winnipeg, Teresa Ducharme, who also had polio, said she's upset. Ducharme has never met Nancy B., yet says she feels a connection to her.
I need her as a pillar of strength for myself, not to give up hope, not to give up wanting to be here for a purpose and to help others.
Some still hope Nancy B. will change her mind. A group of people in Vancouver who are on ventilators have sent this videotape to Quebec City. It shows how technology can help paraplegics, but Nancy's lawyer says her client didn't want to see it.
Dr. Marceau said the door was closed to anyone who might want to change Nancy's mind. Many disabled people wanted to make contact, but some, like Rick Watson, who has cerebral palsy and writes a column for the Vancouver Province, thought they were putting on too much pressure.
I am disappointed by and ashamed of my fellow people with disabilities across the country who would impose upon Nancy their self-righteous indignation over her legal right to make a choice. They themselves have made a choice, and in their view, the only right and moral one. If they have a right to make choices, why doesn't Nancy? Nancy's choice may be different from theirs. I respect anyone's right to choose life, and I also recognize and respect Nancy's equal right to choose death.
Justice Dufour ordered that Nancy's treatment should be continued for 30 days, a period in which an appeal could be filed. That period passed without an appeal, and 8 days later, on February 13th, Nancy B. exercised her right. Tom Kennedy.
Nancy B. made her final decision here at her hospital a few days ago. Doctors began administering tranquilizers, and this morning, unconscious with her family around her, her respirator was cut off. She died 7 minutes later. Across the country today, Nancy's death evoked sympathy and sadness. Deborah Kennard spent years in a hospital room like Nancy's, but eventually moved into a specially equipped apartment and now lives on her own. She wonders if Nancy was offered the same option.
I had no concept that I could leave intensive care one day and actually live in my own apartment. So part of me empathizes and part of me is very sad.
In Vancouver, Jeanette Anderson asks herself the same question.
It is sad, because even with a disability and ventilator, the whole bit, there are a lot of possible things in this world, a lot of good things.
The head of a handicapped rights group wonders today if people will learn from Nancy.
As a society, have we allowed her to not die with dignity, but have we permitted her to live with dignity?
Last month, Nancy's doctors said they had given her the option of leaving intensive care, and tonight, her lawyer said her client simply no longer wanted to live.
The right that we were fighting for was the right to decide if you want to be treated or not, basically. And I think, yes, she did have lots of options. And in final analysis, it was her choice.
And Janice Koffel understands the choice made. She once had the same disease, but recovered after 3 months.
I understood that she attempted twice to starve herself to death. I certainly would have done that, I believe. I believe that. There's no way I would have lived for 2.5 years like that.
Over the past few months, sympathetic individuals and groups have tried to contact Nancy, but she would speak only to her doctors and her family. She wanted privacy. But in the future, whenever a patient's right to refuse treatment is questioned, the tragedy and the legal precedent of Nancy B. will be remembered. Tom Kennedy, CBC News, Quebec City.
During the 2 years that Nancy B. was in hospital, her main contacts were with medical staff trained in acute care. Can they really provide a realistic picture of the options available to disabled people? We'll look at that question when we come back.
For people who are paralyzed from the neck down by car accidents or for other reasons like Nancy B. was, their first experience with disability is limited to an intensive care unit, and they turn their lives over to the care of medical experts. But should other experts, people with disabilities, be more involved in the process of helping people along? The following excerpt is from an article on the subject written by Simon Brissenden for the British magazine Disability, Handicap and Society. The article is titled Independent Living and the Medical Model of Disability.
Our opinions as disabled people on the subject of disability are not generally rewarded with the same validity as the opinions of experts, particularly medical experts. In order to understand disability as an experience, as a living thing, we need much more than the medical facts, however necessary these are in determining medication. The problem comes when they determine not only the form of treatment, but also the form of life for the person who happens to be disabled. As well as the facts, therefore, we need to build up a picture of what it is like to be a disabled person in a world run by non-disabled people. This involves treating the experiences and opinions of people with disabilities as valid and important.
How much did Nancy B.'s stay in intensive care determine the form of her life? Earlier, Shefali Sajani spoke with 3 people about how well Nancy B. was served by the medical community. Vic Willi is with the Centre for Independent Living in Toronto. Amongst the Centre's responsibilities are information and referral and peer support for people with disabilities. Rene Dellaire is with the Rehabilitation Institute of Montreal. And Dr. Rob Buckman works at Sunnybrook Health Science Centre, an acute care and long-term care hospital in Toronto.
Dr. Buckman, do you think that the healthcare system let Nancy B. down?
No, I don't, actually. From my understanding of the situation, she had the options. And it seemed from the statements that she was satisfied that her medical team had explained the options to her, and that she made the decision that although those options would satisfy some people, and that would be a quality of life that they could embrace and stay with, it wasn't for her, and she literally opted out. And in some respects, I can't imagine any service that would provide so much that nobody would ever want to die rather than stick around with a quality of life that they thought was insufficient.
Okay, we'll talk about what can be done for people. Mr. Willi, do you agree with that? Do you think that the healthcare system met Nancy's needs?
I find it difficult to, because I find it very difficult to imagine how a person who's been staring up at acoustic tiles on a ceiling and watching a senseless babble on TV for a couple years, that being her definition of her life at that time, could have made an informed decision about what it's like to live with a disability independently in the community. There are people doing that all across the country. Many of them have had to fight and have lived independently, some because of or some in spite of the healthcare system. But I don't tend to take the healthcare system to task as much as I do society. But anyway, my point is that I find it very difficult to see her making an informed decision under those circumstances. It's a lousy place to live, and who would want to live in a chronic care hospital? In fact, how can you live? It's not a life at all. And so her decision is based on her experiences, based on nothing else but being in that chronic care hospital. And did she want to go on living there? Obviously not.
It's the fact that she had to spend 2 years in an acute care hospital before, raising that question to the court. That is where the system is wrong. We need to have rehabilitation programs early on, and not in acute care hospitals, but in rehabilitation centers.
A lot of the discussion around Nancy B's case has revolved around the question of rights and the right to die. Do you think that that is the central right that people should be focusing on, or are there other rights that are at stake?
We have to really stand and show that there is the right to live and live with dignity as well.
Do you accept that there may be people, very small numbers of people, who, given everything that they could have, still say, this is not what I want, I would rather that my existence came to an end, even if they can be out of a chronic care unit or whatever, that they just value it over a period of time, not just acutely depressed? But do you accept that there might be people who say that?
Sure they can. Sure, it's quite possible. It's quite possible, but it is most likely to be possible and more acceptable if the person really had the possibility to experience the way of
Dr. Buckman,
living.
that's a fairly hypothetical question. I mean, in the case of Nancy B., Monsieur Dellaire from the province of Quebec, do you think that she had access to the types of options that Dr. Buckman would suggest she could then reject?
Well, unfortunately, it's not in an acute care hospital that you're able to get the right rehabilitation that a person so severely disabled as Nancy B. was. It's not in an acute care hospital that you're able to get a good rehabilitation program that can take you back into into trying to have a better way of living.
Mr. Willi, do you think that people in the acute care system are aware of the types of options available in rehabilitation?
How could they be? It's impossible. And I mean, people from the disabled community tried to get to her and were not able to get to her. I mean, I agree with you, Doctor. Sure, there are people that you can throw everything at them and their quality of life is such that they choose, and that's their right. And on the surface of this, Nancy B. may have been one of those people, and there may have been a little victory here for people with disabilities for the first time after a long history of often never having the choice and the ability to make choices and control our lives. There's the appearance here of a small victory in that she asked for a choice and she was granted it. But that's very dangerous to focus on that as a real victory, because there's something much darker, much sinister down the other track.
Do you think that people like Mr. Willi should have been involved in Nancy B's decision? I mean, adding to the various pressures on her, Dr. Buckman?
It seemed, I mean, again, I'm only judging from the newspapers and television, and it seemed that she was very clear that she'd got all the options explained to her. Now, I think that Vic is making a very important point, which is actually one of the most positive things to come out of this. Not just the right to die, which is on one side of the thing, and that I think, has been held up in many, many court cases up till now. It was a surprise to me that it was a surprise that the Supreme Court of Quebec would have just, would have said that, because I would have expected them to. But the other point is that the doubt that you're raising, Vic, is a really very valuable thing, because in the next case, what we have to be sure is that the options are available and are explained in order to quell that doubt. And maybe Nancy B was one of these rare individuals, or doubt, maybe it hadn't been explained to her clearly. So you've increased the desire to explain the options clearly and have them available.
It's not only explaining the options, it's having those options out there. And when a society does not have those options, where there are steps everywhere, where there are no accessible housing, where there are no support services, what's the implication of that? The implication is that we don't want you. Well, it makes it unacceptable to live in society and impossible. So what choices are you left with? Society has to take responsibility for making itself open and accessible.
How do they do that? How do we get those?
By putting in the support
available?
service that people with disabilities have been asking for years. We are not social pariahs meant to be locked away. We have a right, we are citizens of this country, to live out in the community like everybody else. I'm a bloody taxpayer, and 90% of my taxes go to services that I can't use, such as subways and buildings and roads that I can't even get on a bus, for heaven's sakes.
Mr. Dellaire, I want to close with you because this happened in the province of Quebec, and I just want to find out what you think you can actually do about it to make sure that these rights are available.
The first thing that we're trying to do right now is really to focus on rehabilitation. Okay? From the rehabilitation, then go to, what Vic is talking about is also, I also agree a lot. There has to be more in the community that is available to disabled people, so that the right to live with dignity will be not only a right, but will be a challenge for everyone.
Some of those options for ventilator users who want to move back into the community are outlined in this guidebook. Published by the Independent Living Resource Centre in Winnipeg, it's called Breathing Easy. It touches on many things, including plans for moving out, how to get help, checklists, renovations, and how to train your support staff. If you want more information, write to us. We'll give you our address at the end of the show.
Coming up next on DNet, what does the future hold? The case of Nancy B. is an individual legal decision, according to Federal Justice Minister Kim Campbell. She says it involves the right to refuse treatment in a specific case, but does not set precedents in the areas of euthanasia or assisted suicide.
But it's a case that has, as Vic Willi said earlier, raised some sinister possibilities. And Stephen Connor, a lecturer in medical ethics, expressed the same concerns in an article he wrote for the Toronto Star. He says the debate about euthanasia is just beginning.
Canadians are getting older and more young people are permanently disabled by swimming and motor vehicle accidents. But at the same time, the cost of medicine is becoming too heavy to bear. At some point, we'll have to put a firm ceiling on the spending. It's the sensible thing to do. But when we reach that point, what will we cut? Unless we are careful, we might want to target the frail and disabled. Their care is expensive and often lifelong. In the name of cost-cutting and efficiency, it could become tempting to subtly convince them that the only decent thing to do, for society's sake, is to choose euthanasia. Thoughts for the future. That's our show. I'm Joe Coughlin.
And I'm Susan Pettit. We'll leave you with pictures of people who use respirators and have moved back out into the community in British Columbia and Ontario. Have a good week.
Our address is the Disability Network, CBC Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W186. That's Disability Network, CBC Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W186. Or you can fax us at 416-975-5636.